Welcome to What's What with Heather Harris, the podcast for the fiercely hopeful. Here, we explore the lesser-known innovations, overlooked ideas, and hidden forces quietly shaping our human experience. I'm your host, Heather Harris. Let's find out what's what. If someone has built an immense fortune, it has to be a reflection of value created, right? An innovation or some risk that they've bravely taken. But what if that story is only part of the truth? And what if behind some of the world's largest fortunes, there are systems that are quietly concentrating power, shaping policy, and widening the gap between those who have and everyone else? In Burned by Billionaires, Chuck Collins pulls back the curtain on how extreme wealth isn't just a personal success story. It's a structural force. And it's a force that influences housing, healthcare, climate, and democracy itself. It is also a system that is designed to be protected and perpetuated. This situation demands clarity as it impacts us all. Once we understand how wealth concentration actually works, how tax systems are shaped, how philanthropy can both help and obscure, how power quietly consolidates, we can start asking better questions. And better questions, as always, lead to better possibilities. So today we're stepping into a conversation that can feel uncomfortable, even overwhelming at times, but we're doing it with intention because there are people like Chuck who are not just naming the problem, but actively working towards solutions that might include fairer tax systems, more accountable wealth structures, and a reimagining of what an economy could look like if it were designed for the many and not just the few. This is a conversation about inequality, but it is also a conversation about agency. It is about understanding those systems that perpetuate extreme wealth inequity and the power that we have to change them. Perhaps a more balanced, more humane economy isn't as far away as we have been led to believe. Let's get into it. Thanks so much for joining me today, Chuck. This is a very relevant, top-of-mind conversation for so many. Tell me, you've dedicated a lot of your life, if not most of your life, examining and being critical of extreme wealth, inequality, inequity. What first made you question the system that created this billionaire wealth?
Well, I guess I should say right up the top, I actually grew up in a wealthy and affluent family in the suburbs of Detroit. By no means a billionaire family, but now looking back on the 70s and 80s, the folks that were kind of my family and peers have seen their wealth accelerate, even if they're just in the top 1% or the top 10%, top 1/10 of 1%. We've been the winners. So I've sort of had this front row unusual intimate seat on wealth. At the same time, I grew up in Detroit, and I watched what happened to my hometown as a young person. And I think that sort of lit a little fire in me about the harms of inequality, the gap between city and suburb, race, white and black, rich and poor. There was no good explanation, no justification that worked for me on why that was at all a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Was that woven into your family culture? I just recently watched one of your TED Talks, and you mentioned that your background, your family heritage comes from the Oscar Mayer business. Was that woven into your family culture, being aware of this disparity and this lens of social justice and equality?
It was definitely part of my immediate family. I think we were just a part of a large entrepreneurial family that, like a lot of families, had built businesses that grew over time, but didn't sort of achieve a oligarchic power status.
Right.
We may have had the best Wienermobile cruising the highway, but we weren't lording over people like today, dictating the price of meat. There was still sort of a competitive marketplace. And, as I grew older, really I became more aware of just the level of inequality. The 1% are awfully wealthy, but now, just even the last 5-6 years, there's kind of a acceleration, like almost a turbocharging of the inequalities. And the wealth isn't just flowing to the top 1%, it's that sort of top 1/10 of 1% or the billionaire class that are really reaping the benefits.
Mm-hmm. Well, in your recent book, Burned by Billionaires, you argue that extreme wealth isn't just a moral issue, but it's a systemic issue. So this is something that has been created through all kinds of policies and consolidation of the wealth at that very, very top echelon. What did you mean by this, that it's a moral issue and a systemic issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think each individual is responsible for their lives, and how we behave. And if you have $1 billion, you have a huge impact on the lives of other. But it's not necessarily a personal issue. It's sort of how the system now seems to be wired to funnel wealth to the top. In the 30 years after World War II, we sort of had an economic system where the productivity gains of new technologies and the like were shared with workers across the board. We really did, for 30 years, have a rising tide. The middle class and the working class and the rich all sort of grew in tandem. We all saw wealth and opportunity increase. The racial wealth divide started to narrow. Now, the productivity gains are not flowing to workers. They're flowing primarily to investors and capital and the wealthy. So we've rewired the economy. So I would say we would be better off in an economy with more thousandaires, more people with $1,000s of reserves, and fewer billionaires. Mm-hmm. And it's not personal. I mean, there are some badly behaved billionaires, and there's some exemplary billionaires who are trying to do the right thing. It's not sort of, we shouldn't focus so much on the individual behavior, as tempting as it can be, but look at the wiring, if you will, of the economy and how that's what's broken. So we need to rewire the economy back to a shared prosperity economy and away from a funneling wealth up economy.
Because it benefits us all in society. No matter what your wealth status is, it does benefit us all. A lot of people, I think, assume that this kind of wealth is accrued through either inheritance, so it's like a dynastic sort of passing down of this wealth, or through innovation and hard work, right? Like achieving that dream, or the American dream, if we're talking about the US. What has your experience and your research revealed about how these fortunes are actually built and also protected?
Yeah. I kind of devote a chapter to this kind of debate really on how is wealth created. So we know if we're looking again sort of at that top 1/10 of 1%, the 50 million and up group, about half that wealth comes in the form of inheritance. So that's kind of my story. I picked my parents. I lucked out. So that's not a lot of skill involved in that I'm aware of. But then there is entrepreneurial wealth. And actually, this is where I find we need a little more of a nuanced discussion, because let's celebrate the people who come up with an invention, a business, a better mousetrap, whatever. That should be rewarded. We should celebrate that.
Absolutely.
What I think happens, though, is that when people start to accumulate wealth at a certain level, they begin to invest in wealth defense. They begin to say, oh, how do I prevent my neighbor from building a better mousetrap and competing with mine? Or how can I hire all the tax planners and accountants to help me avoid tax and shift my tax obligations onto everyone else so I can get more? And so all of a sudden, it's not about money and consumption, it's about power. And that's when we should take alarm. And then we're living through what I would call political capture phase, where huge wealth is kind of like using its power in the political sphere, often to block very popular things that most people would like, but are not in their interest. Taxing extreme fortunes to fund healthcare. The rich do not seem to be backing up that program. And then the final stage is sort of like, I call it hyper extraction. It's when the wealth turns predatory. You've got so much wealth. I've got $10 billion. I'm starting to invest it in things that extract more wealth from the real economy to the detriment of everybody else. And that's the moment I think we're in.
And that's the moment you think we're in. That's kind of frightening. You mentioned wealth defense, and it's a term that comes up in your book quite a bit. There's a whole industry that is built around wealth defense. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a whole other book on this called The Wealth Hoarders: How Billionaires Spend Millions to Hide Trillions. And it's about this industry. And again, it's not a moderate income or affluent household getting somebody to do planning for their financial planning. That's a good thing to do. These are professional, I think they're like an enabler class, tax attorneys, wealth managers, accountants. Their goal is to help the billionaires minimize tax, grow the pile, make it bigger, and pass on as much wealth down the sort of narrow bloodline, i.e. dynastic wealth.
Mm-hmm.
That is their mission.
Yeah.
And they're well paid, and it's really a kind of a whole sector now that serves and enables the wealthy. And they're a class in and up to themselves, and they defend the interests of the wealthy and themselves. And they have all these tools in their toolbox, trusts and shell companies and offshore tax havens, and they sort of help basically create the shell games to help the wealthy move their money to the shadows.
Hide and protect their money. And I think that's a common belief out there that, the uber rich have access to these loopholes so they don't contribute to the better of society through taxation like the middle class and the lower class do. So what are these loopholes that they can access? Is it primarily through taxation, or as you say, is it offshore? Like where are they hiding this money and how?
Well, a lot of it's hidden in plain sight. Let's say you and I get together, we have $1 billion, we want to move it to the shadows. Usually, typically, we'll create a number of anonymous shell companies. We may move money to bank accounts and corporations in Panama or the Great British Virgin Islands. We move the money around like a giant chess game. But then we go out and buy real estate. We buy luxury real estate and other assets around the country, but in an anonymous form. And then we form trusts, dynasty trusts. We go to South Dakota or Wyoming or some of these states that have sort of changed their laws to attract billionaire wealth hiders. And we create a system of trusts so that money can pass anonymously to the next generation. So that's just a little window into it. But, in some ways, the money is here. It's here in our housing market, certainly. That's one of the reasons why housing costs have, I think, been pushed up, is there's so much wealth chasing financial returns in the housing market.
Mm-hmm. You do speak about that in your book as well. The housing market, healthcare, certainly. And I was surprised to read pet care, veterinary care. I mean, it's really any opportunity for profit. This private equity is really moving in and pushing up the prices so that it becomes so much less affordable for the lower and the middle classes.
This is one of the ways that ordinary folks are getting burned by billionaires. And I think the piece that's hard to understand is like, if you have $1 billion, even if you take 20% and you chase after high returns, and you said private equity, you get some investment people that are going to invest it for you through a private equity fund. What they're looking for is, how can I extract money from the healthcare system or veterinary care or housing? How can I extract more from consumers and government and localities, squeeze more out of the, productive economy and siphon off money? It's a form of plunder, really, is how we should think about it. And that's where it really touches our day-to-day lives.
Yeah, you gave an example in your book about a local hospital to where you live. Do you want to just take us through that example of how the people are actually, squeezed and plundered?
Yeah, I mean, healthcare is a really good example. It's a huge part of our economy. And the billionaire wealth extractors know that there's money to be made. I grew up in the Boston area, and there's this Carney Hospital was owned by the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Boston. It was bought by private equity fund Cerberus Capital. They bought 9 other hospitals in Massachusetts and a few in other states. And their model is not to improve healthcare. It's how can we extract more money from healthcare? How can we squeeze the patients, the workers, the physicians, They slice the real estate assets off and put it in one shell company and pay fees to themselves and others. It's just like wringing a towel for every drop of water is basically their model. They invest not in healthcare, but in billing. That's like the first thing that they invest in. So that's just an example that unfortunately touches too many of us.
Mm-hmm.
If you go to the hospital involuntarily, it's not like you're shopping around. You're in the ambulance. You're like, how much is this going to cost?
Yeah.
You just get endless bills from the different, the physicians group, the anesthesiologist groups. A lot of those are owned by these billionaire investor groups. So it's not making us healthier. It's making us sicker, and it's squeezing every little nickel that people are spending on healthcare, which is already too much.
Yeah. I mean, I'm in Canada, so we do have universal healthcare, which I am very, very grateful for. But it's something that really impacts everybody right in their own homes, in their own bodies. You also talk about the impact on the environment that these billionaire investor groups can have, because again, it's the same thing. If you're squeezing for profit, you are not thinking about short-term, long-term social good.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all need to do our part to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and look at our own lifestyle. But let's not forget, the billionaires tend to fly on private jets, have these mega yachts that are huge polluters. They have multiple homes. They're jetting around the world. The average carbon footprint for North Americans, Canadians, and US folks is about 14 tons a year and going down. But the average carbon footprint for the top 1/10 of 1% is 80% of a ton a day.
Oh my gosh.
So 14 tons a year, you and I.
Yeah.
The average top 1/10 of 1%, the 50 million and up group, almost 4/5 of a ton a day. So they're the super emitters. And they're the ones who need to change their behavior the most and the fastest. And then there's a segment of the oil, gas, and coal, the oligarchs, I call them. They use their wealth and power to block our society's ability to make a transition to a healthier society. In the US right now, it's very unfortunate. I mean, we're keeping coal plants open that they should have been closed, and now we're keeping them open just to subsidize our president's donors,
Yeah.
There's no economic or ecological reason to keep them open.
No, it's actually moving backwards as opposed to moving forwards and progressing in an environmentally sensitive way. So you did mention just a few minutes ago, when we were talking about loopholes and how the billionaire class hides their money or keeps them in the shadows. What role do international tax havens and global financial systems play in this issue? And can they even be reformed?
Yeah, I mean, we've occasionally gotten to a window into how this global system works, mostly thanks to leaks and the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. And, well, we don't know the exact size of the amount of money because it's hidden, but estimates are somewhere like in the 20 to 30 trillion dollars is hidden in offshore tax havens, hidden in trusts and shell companies and moving around. And we kind of hear about the Cayman Islands or Panama or Great British Virgin Islands, but actually the United States has become a huge tax haven. I alluded to this, that there's probably 10 states within the U.S. because of our very federalist state autonomy system that have written their laws to become internal tax havens. You can set up a trust in a dynasty trust in South Dakota, and you don't have to report anything to the public. It's anonymous. The money grows, and it passes to the next generation of billionaire heirs without any accountability or oversight. So yes, that whole system is part of it. Your question about how do we reform it? I actually think if the United Kingdom, the UK and the Commonwealth countries, and the United States join together in tandem, most of those tax havens are in the sphere of influence of, they still are overseen by the Privy Council courts and things like that.
Right.
If the two Anglo superpowers decided that they were going to fix, then close down and shut down the system and require transparency, it would go a long way toward closing down those loopholes.
Yeah.
And I think that there have been moments when there's the political will to do that. Not this moment, but
yeah, this is an interesting moment that we're living in, Chuck. I have to say, a very interesting moment. If governments, either a consortium of Anglo government like the UK, US, Canada, and other European nations were to come together, or within the US itself, there was the will to address wealth inequality, what would some of those policies look like?
Well, one would be absolute transparency and ownership. This whole idea that you can create a limited liability company in Delaware where you do not have to disclose who the beneficial owner is. And then you can engage in all kinds of criminal activities. You know, they've traced all these predatory sex websites and stuff like that back to these Delaware incorporated limited liability companies. So transparency and ownership of real estate. How is it that we don't know who owns the luxury condo building next door? The United Kingdom and the European Union countries are looking at transparency of ownership. Another would be uniform tax disclosure. Every country, corporations and individuals need to just countries share information about who's paying taxes. So we're not being pitted against each other, a billionaires, and saying, well, I pay my taxes in Canada. But, well, okay, how would we know? A third set of reforms around a little bit arcane, but trust law. Trusts and corporate law they've created these ownership forms that have no use other than tax avoidance or tax dodging. So let's just shut down some of these entities, just outlaw certain kinds of entities and certain kinds of trusts and transactions, and invest in enforcement. And this is more a U.S. problem, but we've decimated the oversight and enforcement functions around tax. And so, the system has become almost voluntary for the ultra-rich.
Right.
And those are attainable. I mean, 130 countries came together and passed uniform corporate tax laws. We could do the same around individual tax and have a higher level of accountability.
Yeah, that all makes very, very good sense. Are there examples? I mean, you just gave one example in terms of corporate tax, but are there examples where societies have successfully reduced extreme wealth concentration through these kinds of policies or others?
Yeah, I mean, I think both historically and living examples today. I mean, I would just say, I say this to people in the United States did it, between the end of World War II, 1945 to the mid 70s, we greatly reduced inequality. We had a very progressive tax system. The ultra-rich paid much higher inheritance taxes and income taxes, and those were invested in public goods like debt-free college and access to home ownership and things that help build a modern middle class. So the Nordic countries today continue to tax wealth. I think you all in Canada do a much better job of sort of holding a social norm that we have a floor of decency through which people cannot fall, and there's limits to the wealth and power concentrations at the top. So I think there's lots of examples. And I think, jumping ahead here, I'm actually quite optimistic that the U.S. is going to turn the corner on this. People are awakening to what you and I are talking about, Heather, the harms of extreme inequality.
Yeah.
The pandemic was a crash course in that.
Yes.
We saw billionaire fortunes surge since 2020. Why? It's because they're able to rig the game. So even if you admire entrepreneurs and admire and want to defend capitalism, this is actually undercutting the best aspects of a private, healthy, free market society. So yeah, I'm optimistic because I think people are waking up, and there's sort of cracks emerging in the system, if you will, around the wealth defense industry. Even there's a lot of people defecting. There are a lot of people. We know a lot about what's going on because people who work in that profession are sharing information and testifying against a system of vast hidden wealth.
Yeah. And there are people who have that wealth, who are stepping back and saying, this is not an equitable system that I want to participate in anymore. There's a group called, I think it's the Patriotic Millionaires in the US, and maybe they also exist beyond the borders of the US.
Actually, there's a chapter in Canada now too. Yeah, I'm very involved with the Patriotic Millionaires, and again, think of this as these are mostly entrepreneurial millionaires and billionaires who basically say people like us should pay higher taxes, there should be higher minimum wages, and money should not run our political system. So yeah, check out the Patriotic Millionaires, and if you're in Canada, there's a very robust chapter forming of Patriotic Millionaires in Canada as well.
Well, that's good to know. Yeah, and just touching on that, I don't know if we've really discussed it, the impact of billionaires on democracy, like having that power to manipulate the political system. It's quite frightening to me.
We don't quite have a vocabulary. At least I know people in the United. What is it? An oligarchy? Is it a plutocracy? Is it? Are we becoming a hereditary aristocracy of wealth and power? But essentially, our democracy has been hijacked or captured by big money. And again, in a U.S. context, you can see the influence of people running for office. You have to kiss the ring and get the blessing of some high wealthy donors to be considered a credible candidate. Now, all of this is changing because there are people running for office who are saying, no, I don't want money from billionaires. I'm going to run to work for an economy that helps lift up everyone, not just the rich. And I'm going to be accountable to voters and not donors. And some of those folks are going to start winning office, and that's going to help shift the dynamics here. But right now, both of our U.S. political parties have been captured by the donor class.
Well, I'm really thrilled to hear that you are seeing the change and that we are seeing the change. You had quoted in your book a 2024 Harris poll in which it said 60% of young Americans believe that the billionaire class is really impacting their ability to achieve the American dream. So you're right. Like, the eyes of society are opening. And I think this is a really, really hopeful thing. So what could the youth do? What could the economically disadvantaged do to make themselves feel like they have more agency in making this shift?
Yeah. One is, and my hope is that people will read Burned by Billionaires just to sort of have that lens. How do these inequalities touch my life in every corner of my life? And that when we kind of argue about taxes at the very local level, that we look upstream to understand we've been shifting taxes off the wealthy onto workers, off the federal onto states and localities. We've been doing that for 40 years, and now we're butting heads at the local level. So part of it's just sort of understanding that. But then what I see, and I think of my own children, they are engaged. When there's candidates who are authentic and really want to address the harms, that they get out there. Like in New York, the mayor of New York, Zohran Mamdani, captured the imagination of all these young people because he said, we need to have an affordable city. We need to be able to afford to live here, and we're going to tax millionaires and billionaires to fund that. And he won in a landslide. And that's New York, and New York's its sort of own unique political configuration. But actually, I can show you in Maine and Iowa and all over the country, similar candidates, and young people are powering those campaigns. They're also really tuned into mutual aid, helping one another, not waiting for government to solve problems. You act where you have a sense of agency, as you said. So we're going to form communities of care. We're going to take care of one another. But if there are opportunities to change policy, some of the most popular politicians among young people are like Senator Bernie Sanders, who just introduced a new wealth tax proposal on billionaires, and Senator Elizabeth Warren in Massachusetts, an updated, really thoughtful, sophisticated wealth tax proposal, an annual wealth tax, which we don't have in the U.S. We have income tax, and we have a very porous and weak inheritance tax or death duties. We don't have an annual wealth tax. And there is a really robust discussion happening on that. And it's really propelled by young people who are saying, where are we going here? What kind of society are we going to become if we just allow these inequalities to keep growing? So I'm encouraged. So yeah, I think, being involved in caring for people in your community, but also running for local office, running for state positions, bringing ideas to these forums, voting for candidates who are working for an economy that works for everyone. Mm-hmm. I think that's very promising.
It's very promising. And these are real and practical things that we can do that will affect change. So in 20, 30, 40 years, we're living in a very different society that is more equitable. And I love that term that you just said, communities of care, because we all benefit. And it doesn't take away an entrepreneur's ability to accrue wealth. But how much is enough, right?
Yeah.
How much is enough?
How much is enough and how much is too much?
And how much is too much?
And I think the answer to the how much is too much question is not about consumption or well-being. It's about power. Mm-hmm. And, I argue when in US dollars, when you cross the $50 million mark, you're not just buying another house or a boat, you're buying a senator or a media outlet. Billie Eilish, the singer, said, if you're a billionaire, why are you a billionaire? I mean, how much money, how much is enough? How much is too much? Mm-hmm. And we tend to not want to grapple with those questions, but now it's whacking us over the head. Too much. Some people have too much wealth and power, and it's undermining everything we care about.
Yes.
Including a healthy capitalist free market. That's what you care about. It's undermining that. And we have this kind of like cartoonish debate, socialism versus capitalism. There's 31 flavors of capitalism out there. The U.S. is living through this hyper extractive capitalism that's, we're eating our seed corn. We're destroying the sources of wealth, the ecological and community sources of wealth. And it's not good for, as you said, Heather, it's not good for anybody, including ultimately the wealthy in our societies.
Exactly. What kind of legacy are you leaving for your own children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren? So it's something that impacts us all. So you did say that you are optimistic. And as you know, this podcast is for the fiercely hopeful. And a lot of people do feel disenfranchised and powerless in the face of this wealth inequity. What gives you the most hope today?
Well, you kind of mentioned it in that there's a lot of younger people who aren't buying the old narrative of, the wealthy deserve everything they have because they got up early, they worked hard, they're smarter than the rest of us, whatever. There's a appropriate skepticism about that narrative because, it's pretty obvious. This is the powerful rigging the rules to get more wealth and power. Mm-hmm. So that gives me, and then I see even in my own community, young people like in their 20s stepping up to run for office, to work on campaigns, not just candidates, but issue campaigns. A bunch of states have initiatives to institute millionaire taxes. Where I grew up in Michigan, there's the voters of Michigan will vote this year to raise taxes on incomes over $1 million to fund education. California, emergency wealth tax, a 5% tax on billionaires to fund healthcare. And I think when you put together, tax luxury real estate transfers, think about Toronto and Vancouver and New York City and all these luxury units that no one is living in for the most part. They're just like, safe deposit boxes where the rich park their money. What a waste of energy and labor power and resources. So rich people can just have a box in the sky that they can count on their ledger. So tax luxury real estate and fund social housing. Tax private jets and private jet fuel. These are folks who aren't paying their fair share of the ecological and airspace. Tax them and fund green infrastructure. So these are campaigns that I see emerging all over. I think of them as game-changing campaigns. Tax the harm, invest in the good. And that's, I think, we're going to see a lot of that in the coming years. And, there are dark scenarios. Things can definitely, particularly when you mix war and global weaponry into the world, these conflicts, then, there's some bleak scenarios. But I actually think we hopefully will turn the corner in the short term, and in the next decade, we will turn away from these concentrations of wealth and power back to the beloved community.
I love that. I'm going to hang my hat on that. Well, thank you so much, Chuck, for having this conversation with me today. I'm going to put a link to your latest book in the show notes, but where can my listeners find and follow you, learn more so that they can raise their voice in this endeavor as well?
Well, I welcome people to check out inequality.org. It's the website that I co-edit, and we put out a weekly newsletter, and we try to share the good news and where we can have some agency and examples of what people are doing. So inequality.org it's an international portal on research and commentary and data on inequality. And yeah, for if you're interested in more of my writing, chuckcollinswrites.com is a kind of writing website where I have a Substack and the other books that we've talked about as well.
Yeah, I'm going to be doing a deep dive into your other books as well. I really enjoyed Burned by Billionaires. I learned a lot. So I'm very, very grateful for your work and for opening our eyes.
Thank you, Heather. And thanks for having these conversations. You're keeping us focused on moving forward.
Thank you for joining me on What's What with Heather Harris. If you enjoyed this conversation, please follow, rate, and share the show. It helps others find their way here, because the more the merrier. The future is something that we influence and imagine together. I'm Heather Harris, and until next time, stay curious and stay fiercely hopeful.